Kapil, for inviting me to this series of discussions that you have been hosting. I think they are pretty interesting. I've been following this for the last couple of weeks, and it's extremely glad to be over here discussing my viewpoints over it. Prior to me, Rajeshri, it was great to hear your viewpoints, and I think there are overlaps into what I'll share with some of your things. Right? So a little bit about myself. Right? I've worked with some of the large technology players like CA Technologies, Hewlett Packard, Micro Focus. I have worked or sort of advised government into delivery of government to citizen services, right? And for the last couple of years, I have been engaged with a startup in the hyper local retail segment. Right. So what I'm going to share today is like coming from the top, right? How does digital transformation affect, right? What does it mean, right? And then during the COVID times and post-COVID, how are we seeing it changing, right? Both from the large and the established organizations perspective, as well as startups, and I'll cite some examples from what we at magicpin are doing, right? So if I were to take a step back, right, what is digital transformation? Right? Let me just try to revisit that. Right? There are multiple definitions and multiple perspectives on that, right? However, to me, right, in my opinion, digital transformation is essentially, right, it's about business strategy, and digital is something that augments or accelerates business strategy, right? Because that sums up all the elements or all the blocks within digital transformation. Right? So primarily, it's about the business strategy, how the strategy of various organizations, whether it be established organizations or startups, how are they transcending and coping up with this pandemic and after effects, right? So when we talk about business strategy, right, just to give you a few examples, right, it has to start with what is the business outcome that we expect out of any digital initiative, a program, a project, large scale, small scale, right? Whatever we take, right? So to talk of, say, manufacturing side, if we were to think of, okay, a manufacturing unit wants to apply IoT-enabled sensors and devices, to what effect, right? It's not just that because IoT is the buzzword, it has to be driven with a business purpose, right? Whether it's for optimizing your manufacturing processes, bringing in efficiencies and productivity, right? Having a detailed analytical insights into how you want to create the processes, process automation, optimizing the processes. Moving on to the supply side, right? Supply chain side, it's more about driving productivity, efficiencies, right? Real-time insights, and basically lowering the costs towards that. Coming on to sales and marketing, one is how can we better segment using digital? How can we better segment the customers? How can we better reach out to them? How can we have more probabilistic inferences as to where are the chances of me getting a conversion or getting a sale is higher, right? And then on the post-sales client servicing, it's primarily about customer centricity, giving them a wonderful experience. And in all these things, right, it's primarily the business strategy that an organization decides to go ahead with, where the digital plays a role, right? And digital can play a role with innovative processes and a lot of automation and all that stuff, right? A lot of technology pieces coming into the play. But it's important to have that business strategy, those business objectives clearly defined before getting into digital. Right? Now, having said that, right, currently I'm with this startup magicpin, which is into online to offline hyper discovery platform, which engage people online and drives commerce to offline retailers. Right? Retailers could be local mom and pop stores or could be bigger chains. Right? So now, if we look at it like COVID times, right? I would like to divide this COVID times, say, since it started impacting India somewhere around second week of March, into three phases. Right? Number one is the shutdown phase. Second, and the currently ongoing, is the recovery phase. And the third is going to be the new normal, or what the future is going to look like. Right? So let me cover each of these phases, right? Starting March, when we had this shutdown, right? And almost all organizations had to very rapidly think about how do you maintain business continuity. Right? So business continuity was a priority over and above maybe efficiencies, productivity, and anything else, right? How do you maintain, how do you keep people working from home, the connectivity part, access part, authorizations part, right? How do you keep on engaging with the customers? So business continuity was a foremost concern, and I think almost all the organizations very rapidly moved into this space, adopting technology which was most easily accessible and implementable by them to achieve this stakeholder engagement and collaboration, right? To keep the business on, keep the lights on. So this was the shutdown phase. Now in the currently recovery phase, where we have started seeing some green shoots, right, of recovery happening in bits and pieces into certain segments, I think what is taking priority is business resiliency, obviously cost optimization, but at the same time, right, identifying those pockets where the recovery is happening, and how do we, or how does an organization lands its entire workforce to be aligned to achieve that objective and into that segment, right? To take an example, right, from my current organization, right, during the shutdown phase, we very rapidly moved our entire tele operations, our entire tech teams, analyst teams, everyone into working from home mode. Obviously, being a digital native organization, a cloud native organization, that was relatively easier for us. But the challenge was more on the adoption of the things, adoption of the processes, right? Because we were never into work from home mode ever, right? We were always into office. So having people adopt to that, right, that was a primary thing. And I think our teams did a fairly good job in adapting to that very rapidly, right? And we could maintain business continuity for us. Obviously, in the offline segment, in the shutdown phase, we saw a massive dip in our businesses. And that's where we went back to the drawing board to assess on how the recovery and the post-recovery phase is going to look like. So in the current phase, when I would call it more as a recovery phase, where it's more about business resiliency. And it's more about how do we prioritize cost, how do we variabilize the cost to the extent we can, right? Reduce the fixed cost expenditure, being a startup and with limited access to capital, right? How do we variabilize that cost? And it's like having all hands at deck. So for that, like frequent communication with the people, keeping the tempo of the organization at the levels what it is required. So that's the phase that we are in. Now, interestingly, for us, before COVID, right, we were primarily into certain categories, namely food and beverages, maybe fashion, beauty, which were primarily doing very good for us. Right? But during the shutdown phase and now in the recovery phase, we have realized that some of the categories, other categories where we were sort of less penetrated, namely say grocery, pharmaceuticals, right? So we quickly developed our penetration into those categories. Right? So in the recovery phase, we sort of had a very microscopic view of what are we doing, where are we, and which are the pockets which are seeing signs of recovery, and how can we place ourselves into a strong position into those micro segments. Right? So this is about the recovery phase, right? Obviously, with keeping an eye on the cost side, and the best way is to variabilize the cost as much as we can. Right? So, and I talk to a lot of my industry friends, right? And I think most of the organizations are working in that way. Now, what it means is when the business strategy is moving in this direction of identifying those segments, I think digital is something which will definitely be to an aid to any organization, and almost all organizations are looking up to digital to give them that agility in driving these areas. Now, moving forward, once the recovery is established and market is sort of back to a certain levels of pre-COVID times, almost all organizations will have to plan for the new normal. Right? As we all understand, right? It's a often quoted buzzword now, the new normal, because times are going to be fundamentally changed. Right? It's never going back to exactly the same way of doing business, the same ways customers will interact, they will make their purchasing decisions. So at this stage, when we start planning for the new normal, taking care into the future, the innovation, where it needs to happen, where do we sort of put our money, right? And what do we plan for? I think tools like scenario planning comes to very good effect, right? Where you sort of, because it's unknown, right? We cannot predict with a great amount of certainty as to how the future is going to look like. So it's very important to use the tools like scenario planning to help us get ready as to whatever the outcomes may be, right? So we are doing that kind of planning. And what it essentially means for digital and adoption of digital is arming yourself with the capabilities which are core within the organization to be able to adapt to howsoever the scenario unfolds, right? Which is retaining flexibility to adaptation, right, to changing scenarios, resiliency I've talked about, right? And then obviously it's about the agility. How fast can a business respond to the changing scenarios as the new normal unfolds? And last but not the least, and I think the most important, is maintaining customer centricity. Because no matter what, howsoever the scenario unfolds, customer centricity is going to be the key. Now, in all these three key broad areas, right, the retaining the flexibility to adapt, the agility, and retaining customer centricity, I think that is where digital is going to massively lend a hand to the business, right? And in my opinion, businesses are definitely going to look towards digital to enable them to acquire all these three skill sets within the organization. Easier said than done, but yeah, it's not just about technology. It's all about how do you implement that technology, how do you realize that technology for your use cases, right? For the use cases within your company, for what your company's strategy is, right? So like an age-old maxim, right, that necessity is the mother of invention. So I think all businesses in this recovery and the post-recovery with the new normal scenario are going to sort of innovate in either in their processes or in their digital offerings or in the customer outreach in whichever way. And I think digital transformation, while it may be punctuated, as Kapil has used the right term, in the shutdown and the recovery phase, but in the new normal and going forward, it is definitely going to be accentuated, right? It is going to accelerate.